esteemed professors, dear students and friends. I'm very happy to have an opportunity to be with you tonight in this great seat of European conscience for the past 450 years, and to discuss a matter that concerns everybody, which is the future of international law as well as the responsibility of Europe. As I take the floor, I'm mindful of the spirit that breathes within the walls of your university, transmitted down to us like a pledge of fidelity from generation to generation. Fidelity to free inquiry, to critical spirit, to resistance against the spirit of this age and against ready-made opinions. It is within these walls that European modernity was forged, lying to Descartes' axiom. It is within these walls that the forbidden books of Spinoza were discovered in clandestinity, giving rise to those radical Enlightenment ideas that set Europe ablaze with a fire that has never been extinguished. It is within these walls that Einstein taught the laws that open physics to unknown domains. It is within these walls, still not far from the Peace Palace, that it was decided to train those who would dedicate themselves to international governance through law and in its name, at a time when the ruins of the Second World War had not yet been cleared. It is here also that Hugo Grotius studied, considered the founder of international law in its modern form. Of course, there is the age-old tale of violence being tamed by law, that elevation of the mind and reason against the scandals and miseries of the wars of religion, of nations, of empires, which made it possible to set limits on the right to wage war and the rules governing war itself. The 30 Years' War, as depicted by Jacques Callot, which emptied German territories of a third of their population. The 80 Years' War, which secured the independence of the Netherlands. All of this is true, of course. But as always, history has more twists and turns. International law was born as a tool, sometimes even as a ruse, allowing force to be spared rather than tamed. De Mare Liberum by Grotius is not a philosophical treatise. It is the work of a lawyer serving the interest of his own country. Grotius appeals to Roman law to justify the seizure of a Portuguese vessel by the United Provinces, which were not formally at war with Portugal at the time. This may well have inspired Nietzsche to undertake a genealogy of law. International law took flight through the justification of an act of force that others would not have hesitated to call piracy. Between law and force, there will always be politics, because politics is humanity in its raw state. It is emotion and reason, vulnerability and transcendence. It is what in the human condition will always endure. A foundational work, I would even say that before force and before law, there is politics. This is the experience of my entire life. As a diplomat working to articulate a precarious consensus in the language of law. As a prime minister charged with upholding the universality of the law, as a lawyer, a privileged actor within justice, I would even say it is my experience as a citizen before the law, since political life exposes one to many accusations, slanders, even attacks aimed at silencing those who take positions that displease. In the course of this experience, I was able to measure the profound dignity of law and justice system designed to uncover facts and truths. I say this by way of preamble. Politics is faithful to itself only when it sets out clearly and distinctly the principles that illuminate it. It is true to its calling when it is guided by that essential virtue, the courage to name reality and to tell the truth. It is with this demanding spirit that I wish to speak to you today. The alternative today is quite clear. We are being summoned to choose between force and law. And in that context, it will always be force first, or even, as we see today, force alone. A gulf has continued to widen between force and law. In the space of 15 months, the American president ordered the manifestly illegal abduction of the sitting president of a sovereign country, and approved and supported the illegal targeted assassination of a head of state in flagrant violation of the principles and practices of international relations. The State of Israel and the United States bombed Iran twice outside any valid legal framework. 4 years ago, Russia invaded Ukraine without cause and in violation of every rule and treaty. It strikes civilian infrastructures, displaces populations, abducts children, students, teachers, and seasoned practitioners of international affairs. We all sense how dangerously the relationship between law and force has been thrown off its axis. Far off now are those early hours of the 21st century, when the European project still seemed in tune with the international order. It was predicted that European construction will advance in step with the course of the world in a kind of pre-established harmony with the rule of law as its model. We are promised a world in which nuclear disarmament will go hand in hand with the opening of trade, in which the European Union will be an exemplary normative power for the rest of the world. That ideal narrative now lies in ruins. The time for lucidity, our common lucidity, has come. The first lucidity we need is to face the fact that the fragilities of the 1945 order were structural. We owe a debt of gratitude to those generations born from the ruins of the Second World War, to those who rebuilt our devastated countries, who reached out to one another to build a united and peaceful Europe, who overcame their divisions to construct a world of peace. Indeed, at the end of the Second World War, the greatest bloodletting, the greatest act of madness humanity has ever known, nations united around a simple principle: never again. From this appeal to conscience were born the Nuremberg and Tokyo tribunals, the United Nations Order, the Security Council, and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. From this emerged the idea of peace as a common good of humanity, the idea of peace as requiring vigilance, care, and progress. From this was born, let us remember, the strongest surge of international law that humanity has ever known. The The spirit of freedom engendered the spirit of freedom. Decolonization, the non-aligned movement, and third world movements gradually won autonomous space for a humanitarian law that came to the aid of suffering people. The idea of a shared responsibility to protect human rights advanced steadily up to the early 2000s. We are still its heirs, and we should devote all our efforts to proving worthy of it. To be clear, this rule-based order rested on a degree of cynicism. Between 1945 and 1991, the United Nations struggled to work adequately, and the balance between the United States and the USSR was ultimately, we should recognize it, a balance of terror. The two superpowers could not afford direct confrontation. Force was limited by force, not by law alone. After 1990, the disintegration of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War allowed the United Nations to function better, but this supposed golden age of international law rested on the unstable conciliation between a hegemonic American power and a universally shared normative framework, a conciliation that depended on that power's willingness to limit itself. Yet this order carried a structural flaw. The fact that a particular power, when that inherently carried the permanent possibility of double standard, was positioned as the guarantor of universal law, was a structural fragility. The second lucidity we need to have is to face the fact that law is not a collateral damage of the deregulation of force. It is actually a targeted victim of force. We have entered a new era in which we cross thresholds that day by day aggravate the contradiction between law and force. We cross a strategic threshold first with the redistribution of power on the international scale. The Sino-American competition creates a systemic conflict without any arbitrating body capable of containing the escalation to extremes. Another threshold linked to the multiplication of brazen, large-scale violations of international law. Every instance of impunity granted to a major actor weakens belief in law and its universality. Crimea and the Donbass, Greenland, the West Bank are all examples. Last, there is a threshold in the polarization of our societies, torn between the demand for immediate response to crisis and the slowness of international procedures. Procedures that have their rationale, good or bad, but which some find it easy to present as inoperative with the view to disqualifying them. This era is indeed a new age of imperialisms, which now take international law itself as their targets. Through the negation of law, through the use of brute force, the sanctions applied to the guardians of law, the weaponization of laws through lawfare, and the systematic falsification of facts through technological means, social networks, and AI. Donald Trump's second term represents an historical turning point for the order of law and of the world. The intention grows clearer by the day. It is a deliberate project to destroy international law. First, there is the ignorance of law. Every post Donald Trump publishes on his social networks is an expression of ignorance of both the letter and the spirit of the law. He plays a constant word game with references to superheroes, tyrant, mechanism, and the spirit of revenge. Then there is the radical negation of law. His threat of destruction against Iran make him an actor who recognizes no limit to his actions but his own superior morality, against American rules of engagement, against the laws of war that require sparing civilian population and infrastructure, against international institutions from which the United States is withdrawing or refusing to fund. This is not anymore l'État c'est moi, the state is me, but le monde c'est moi, the world is mine, a negation of the otherness of others. Finally, there is the subversion of law through its travesty. The creation of the Peace Council for Gaza has put the war in the fruits. The Security Council acquiesced with Resolution 2803 to its own diminishment. Let us not be misled by the silence that reigns over Gaza. Today, crimes continue, but under the authority of this Peace Council, a people is subjected to undignified living conditions, penned into less than half of Gaza's territory, with barely more than 200 trucks entering the enclave each day, one truck for 10,000 people living in tents or rubble with nothing left to produce, since there are no more fields, no more olive trees, no more factories, nothing. The utmost priority is and remains the same as it has been for many months, to open the doors of Gaza to humanitarian aid, but also to journalists and legal professionals. Europe, if it does not wish to be complicit in a continuation of war beneath the veil of a semblance of law, must today demand, without delay, a mission of inquiry into the actions of this so-called Peace Council. And I remember you that the president of this council for 2 years is the one and only Donald Trump. It is time for the voice of law to make itself heard once more. The negation and subversion of law converge toward the same logic, the claim of unlimited power, and this produces 4 reversals. First, a normative reversal, as the value of a shared rule is swept aside by the unilateral imposition of will. An ethical reversal, where force is no longer inhibited by humanitarian rules. A strategic reversal, as the use of force no longer responds to objectives capable of ending conflict. And last, a historical reversal, finally, as the power that once guaranteed the international order renounces that role to defend nothing but its hegemonic status. Third lucidity we need is to face the fact that the current disorder is the culmination of 25 years of drift. How does the law die? We all recall Hemingway's line about bankruptcy. In the sun also rises. How did you go bankrupt? 2 ways. Gradually and then suddenly. The September 11 attacks started an endless chain of destruction of law's foundations. That terrible trauma shattered the balance that kept the United States in its role as the keystone, both hegemonic and legalist, of the international order, setting in motion a process of habituation and accommodation to the circumvention of law. From this were born the Western military interventions outside the UN framework, whose symbols remain the 2003 invasion of Iraq. It helped normalize military operations conducted outside any international legality. This inconsistent application of law profoundly undermine confidence in international law, feeding the criticism of double standards voiced by countries of the Global South. The same drift has affected the domestic order. There is a natural link, and this is something you should always remember. There is a natural link between the two. We recall the American Patriot Act. In Europe, our national legislations have too often chosen to restrict civil liberties in the name of responding immediately to security imperatives, going so far as to create a situation where the exceptions becomes the rule within ordinary law. There were as many repeated blows against fundamental rights and the rule of law. Let us look around us. Over the past 25 years, an illiberal crisis has gripped the Western world. In 2000, half of humanity lived under a democratic regime with a robust rule of law. In 2025, it is barely a quarter of the world which is living with democratic law. Democracy melts away like the ice caps. Surveillance of citizens has become ingrained in modern democracy by law as well as through technology, such as predictive big data management as rolled out by Palantir, touching on key subjects both of individual rights and national sovereignty. The reign of exception has become the response to the permanent state of crisis. It has become the norm of this new world. The crisis mode is now the default mode of governance, yet the justification of exceptions through crisis is in reality an obstruction of all justice. By multiplying exceptions to the law, this double domestic and international drift has produced a deep loss of confidence, feeding revisionist worldviews, pitting the Global South against the collective West. For law, beyond its formalism, is a trust-based institution. It exists only as long as it is believed in, recognized, supported, expected, feared. It dies when it is no longer practiced as a rule common to everyone, but is considered as a pure instrument, contingent and variable according to specific people or individuals. This is why law is dying today, because people have stopped cherishing and believing in it, because its voice is allowed to fossilize at every level, at the scale of the world, at the scale of entire continents such as Europe, at the scale of each nation defending its rule of law. The struggle for the order of law concerns us all. It's time for the dinosaurs to fight back. The entire order of law is today in danger. That is a fact. We are witnessing organized and widespread campaigns of attacks on the fundamentals of the rule of law. Our age is digging with excavators beneath the foundations of law on several simultaneous strata. First, there is the endangering of the rule of law in its usual sense, which is to protect societies from tipping into total state power. The lesson drawn from the totalitarianisms of the 20th century have led society to guard themselves even against the excessive powers of those who claim to embody the will of people, or what some new call the national sovereignty. Therefore, the key mission of constitutional courts, capable of containing parliament as well as executive power when their decisions deviate from fundamental rights and principles. This is precisely the mechanism the illiberals want to destroy by claiming to restore sovereign democracy, that is, the unlimited power of the people through its representatives. There is another danger directed against a more ancient stratum, one born of the Atlantic revolutions of the 18th century in France and the United States, founded on the principles of the equality of all individuals before the law and with the view to organizing civil society's resistance against the encroachments of absolutist power. Even this Bill of Rights is no longer guaranteed. Under the weight of money and the pressure of force, we are witnessing in the United States a war against the founding principles of law and judicial systems. Arbitrary conducts and impunity for state actors are multiplying, coupled with pressure on judges and prosecutors in violation of the principle of independent justice. There may even be an attack against a more ancient and deep stratum, which guarantees the principle of legality and stability that allows society to breathe. The hierarchy of norms, which has been described very well by Hans Kelsen, constitution, treaties, laws, and regulations, is becoming blurred. Sources of law are fragmenting. In the age of artificial intelligence, the ultimate threat is the disappearance of law in favor of the private technical norm of the smart contract executed automatically by an artificial intelligence or a cryptographic protocol without any human presence. In the state of New Jersey, an algorithm is used in decisions on pre-trial detention, a meeting between blind faith in science and the retreat of human judgment. In Europe too, the order of European law has been wavering. Neither the lessons of the constitutional crisis of 2005 nor those of the Brexit have been learned. Not enough has been done to create confidence in democratic processes in order to counter anti-European feelings. On the contrary, the multiple crises of the two last decades have been used as an opportunity for the European Council to circumvent the European Parliament, while the Commission has been tempted to take over more prerogative in excess of the treaty's provisions. Against that background, there are four main issues at the European level. First, there is a problem of normative inflation linked to the political competition among sources of law. This leads to difficulties in articulating national and European text, along with over-transposition of directives. This feeds growing anti-European sentiment. This is the syndrome of Brexit and the regulation of cucumber curvature. There is also a problem of the quality of norms. European normative power has sometimes drifted toward a regulatory dominance that regulates reality before it had even emerged. The rule of thumb is well known. America innovates, China imitates, and Europe regulates. We must restore a balance between the generality of the norm on the one hand and the power of interpretation by the judge on the other hand. At the same time, differences of pace between the national and the community levels leads to non-application of certain texts, including regulations that are nonetheless directly applicable. Finally, there is a problem of jurisdictional hierarchy. The legal nationalism of certain national constitutional courts asserting the superiority of national constitutional law over European supranational law creates a hiatus that is ultimately untenable. This is the case with the rulings of the Federal Constitutional Court in Karlsruhe which undermine the European normative edifice. More dangerous still, at the global level, a planned effort to de-universalize law, and that's underway in three different ways. The first, by fragmenting it through a set of transnational fiefdoms carved out at the scale of major imperial spheres of influence, each with a regional policeman tasked with rule enforcement as well as rule setting. On this front, the United States and China share the same camp. The second, by making the idea that universal rights applies to all nations meaningless, above all the 1941 Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the 1949 Geneva Convention on the Prevention of Genocide, while advocating for the existence of different sources of law across civilizations. The third, by depriving institutions and courts already often under-resourced in human terms of their capacity to produce effective outcomes in order to blame law for the failures that have been imposed upon it. This is a battle for legitimacy that aims to make force not only the superiority of fact, but paradoxically, a new source of positive law. Every democrat must combat this evolution with ardor. It falls for the political class to sovereign peoples, to each and every one of us, to work to restore the force of law. 25 years of this bashing of the law for alleged ineffectiveness have worn down the culture of peace and weakened the democratic culture that is the foundation of the rule of law. This has opened a breach into which illiberal and identitarian projects are today pouring. Now the years to come look upon us, look upon you for action. Let us say it again and again, law protects citizens, women, men, the elderly, children, the weak as well as the strong. All lives have equal value and dignity. This is the reason for law. This is the honor of law, including international law. This is what some want to be rid of. The political task of our time transcends all borders. It is the re-establishment of a law-based order. There is no lasting power without law. If the short-term trend is negative, nothing would be worse for Europe than to think into skepticism and consign law to oblivion on the pretext of powerlessness. Those who advocate this posture often claim the mantle of realism. This alternative between law and force is in reality nothing but a facade realism, and this for three reasons. First, crisis may multiply, but it is interdependence that characterizes our world. The planetary flows of goods, capital, persons, and ideas create an ever-growing need for arbitration and shared rules. Second, the overwhelming majority of states, and this is an obvious point of convergence between Europe and the countries of the Global South, need a shared framework, a common language, which is law to guarantee their sovereignty and protect them from imperial threats. They look to Europe to be faithful to its long-standing principles and take the initiative. Third, this need for rules exists even among the powers more resistant to international law. The United States and China both need stable normative frameworks capable of guaranteeing the exercise of their economic and technological powers. The need for law does not therefore disappear with the return of force. It deepens. Idealism today is paradoxically on the side of force, in the conviction that the mere use of force is sufficient to reshape reality. I'm a realist of law. I believe that international law is the form we can give to relations between powers that are founded on the balance of force, on the precise condition that we seek to contain and regulate it. This requires moving to action in pursuit of re-establishing a pluralist international legal order. The force of time must return to law. Despite the obstacles, courts must rule on the actions of political leaders who have chosen to violate the law, whatever their nationality. We must refuse impunity. It is by ruling in full independence that the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court will breathe new life into international law, notably on the key question of Gaza, which has become the emblem of Western double standards. It falls to Europe to match its actions to its words and defend the judges and prosecutors of these institutions. Today, subjected to sanctions by the United States, tomorrow, national judges, prosecutors, or those of the European Public Prosecutor's Office may be also targeted. Further, the force of clarity must return to law. Recent decades have ceaselessly blurred the boundaries between domestic and international law by multiplying forms of extraterritoriality. It is not acceptable that American sanctions should apply to non-American nationals on the pretext that they hold a dollar in their pocket or have an American email address. Sovereignty, forgive this truism, begins with legal sovereignty and the refusal of self-orientated extraterritorial encroachments. The force of adaptation must also return to law. It is through political initiative in the service of humanity's general interest that we will be able to restore legitimacy to law. This is the case within the United Nations, where the General Assembly may take up the mantle of legality by using its power of recommendation to the Security Council to try to overcome its blockade. This is also the case with the four great challenges of our time: climate change, within the framework of the Paris Agreement, and biodiversity, both of which much move toward binding measures. Artificial intelligence, for which a universal treaty must assure the modalities of control to prevent it becoming a threat even higher than nuclear weapons. Nuclear proliferation and the international law of outer space and celestial bodies, which is being fragmented into a neo-feudal space of semi-private, semi-public jurisdiction. These four great challenges set the planetary conditions for humanity's future. Only law will allow us to have a common language to address them. The force of democracy, finally, must be ever more closely united with law. There is no democracy without the rule of law. It is the common and vital heritage of democracies which they must defend together. I advocate for a voluntary union of democracies, favoring the coming together of jurisdiction and a convergence of judicial systems on the basis of best practices, for the benefits of an ever closer union of these countries in the field of science, media, freedom of movement of persons and goods, as well as defense industry. An avant-garde regrouping of Europe, Brazil, Canada, India, South Africa, South Korea, Australia, and Japan could commit such a path. Overcoming the loss of confidence in law and working toward its re-establishment are one and the same. It will rest on a material foundation, the interdependence of the world, and on a political foundation, the plurality of actors who need law. The model of a single Western center as guarantor of the international order is behind us. We now need a pluralist international order. Europe has a role to play in such an enterprise. It must play that role out of realism, for this vision in its perfect alignment with our interest, our strategic situation, as well as our principles. The balance of the world depends on our future sovereignty, Europe's strengths and its openness to other powers. Sharing the same spirit is the only way to escape the face-to-face confrontation of China and the United States, which all evidence shows leads to a weapon race and ultimately a war. European sovereignty is the key question of power and political will. And yet we struggle to assume this role through a lack of power first, a lack of political will. A continent in a state of dependence for its security, its energy, or its critical technologies is not in a position to defend international law, let alone contribute to its refounding. The affirmation of European sovereignty is thus at stake across all the fields that defines power today: military and industrial, financial and technological, scientific and cultural. These are the means of sovereignty. These are the conditions for the defense of law. We will win this battle by renewing our acquaintance with what the Greek were calling metis, the ruse allowing us to play the dialectic of independence and global partnership. Independent in certain blocks of sovereignty whose absence would leave us vulnerable, partners of several actors for other resources, using multiple interdependencies to avoid being in any single power's hands and thereby maximizing our room for maneuver. But these material forces need a will to take shape. Legal formalism is not enough to be anything more than an empty wish. European sovereignty needs a political engine. It is my conviction that a European Security Council within the framework of the European Sovereignty Pact must play such a role, articulating national policies around principles of cooperation, interoperability, pooling and consolidation. 5 countries representing 2/3 of the Union's population and wealth must together lead this pioneering project of harmonization across all their policies. The re-establishment of the rule of law within our nations in the name of European humanism is the foundation of a new global legal order. This is the heritage of liberties found on Enlightenment thought, which articulates the natural rights of the human being with the constraints of the social contract. One of the earliest mottos of the French Revolution was "Live free or die." Freedom is neither the only good nor the only need of persons and people. It is the first without which all the others, equality, security, representation, have no value. It is a heritage of check and balances founded on the memory of past sufferings. One enters the reign of arbitrary power easily and through seduction rather than constraint, but one existed only through immense pain. One need only look at the United States. The courts are today the only effective counterweights to the Trumpian drift. Scientific reason has bowed its head in numerous universities. Free journalism has been largely swept away by the weight of money and concentration in the media. The federal states fall prey to the same polarization. There remain at least some upright and courageous judges. Europe's national judicial systems have the opportunity today to innovate, to to improve, to bring justice closer to citizens. This rests, in my view, on 6 principles: an independent justice, which also requires the allocation of greater human and budgetary resources, enabling it to fulfill its promise; a justice of proximity that deals with small-scale disputes. Today, it is perceived as distant, entrenched in its palaces at the heart of metropolitan centers. We need a justice presence everywhere through mobile courts, free mediation or justices of the peace, mobilizing volunteer citizens adequately trained to advocate in first instance on the limited disputes that most irritate our fellow citizens today, from neighborhood conflicts to street incivilities or insults. Proximity also means a justice that respects the principle of oral argument, making it a fully human relationship. An accessible justice through lower costs, and above all, a rethinking of how lawyers' fees, which today create the feeling that the richer party always wins, eventually in legal proceedings, are covered. Universal legal aid, for example, on an insurance-based model deserves serious consideration. Also, a simple justice through an operation to simplify the language of law, today as opaque to our fellow citizens as Church Latin. In a sense, it is time for justice to have its second Vatican Council. An effective justice that multiplies specialized courts and prosecutors' offices in environmental litigation, cybercrime, drug trafficking, financial offenses, and many others, to ensure the degree of specialization and competence required while maintaining the principle of generality to avoid parallel and competing judicial systems. These demand sufficient resources to respond to the issues that affect the lives of many of our fellow citizens, including children and women. I'm thinking in particular of the growing phenomenon of children victimized by prostitution networks, including children in the care of child protection services. This is unacceptable. There notably lies the promise of justice, a faster justice. And on this point, digitalization and the assistance of agentic AI can enable clusters of innovation capable of changing the picture. The progress of justice and democratic engagement are the 2 pillars of the rule of law. Across Europe, our countries are suffering from a crisis of political representation marked by low electoral participation. If we wish to respond to this democratic fatigue which plays into the hands of illiberal projects, our national political systems must also make room for direct consultation of the people as well as for its own capacity for initiative. The organization of citizens, convention, and citizen-initiated referendums are levers for setting our societies in motion again in the direction of progress and confidence in our institution. We will respond to these challenges only by holding together the international order founded on law and the domestic rule of law, the culture of peace and the culture of democracy. The 2 meet in a shared political culture that rests on the sense of limit and restraint, and on a law founded on the relationship with the other. For here is the common thread linking politics and law in the face of force. They share the bond and therefore the possibility of otherness, the possibility of conceiving of common rights even in one's adversary, whereas force severs every bond. This is why law is the politics of humanism. It is the bond made union, it is compassion and empathy put into action. Before closing this address, I wish to return to the Greek source of European humanism by evoking the figure of Ulysses, depicted to us by Sophocles in his tragedy, Ajax. Sophocles depicts a Ulysses caught in the fury of Ajax. After Achilles' death, the Greeks decide by a vote to award his arms to Ulysses and not to Ajax. Ajax's rage is epic. Drunk with fury, he seeks to kill Ulysses and all the Achaean chiefs. Seized by madness, it is the cattle he slaughters. Returned to his senses, he realizes his error and takes his own life. His warrior prestige could not survive the shame. This face-to-face between Ulysses and Ajax is the victory of cunning and democratic intelligence, of political sense and measure, of a brute and archaic force. But Sophocles' tragedy goes further. Ajax has just died. Agamemnon refuses him the funeral honors. Agamemnon considers Ajax as an enemy, since the latter wanted to kill him. It is where Ulysses intervenes and succeeds in convincing Agamemnon that the honors should be rendered to Ajax. A party to the conflict, Ulysses nonetheless manages to step aside the logic of the balance of force and becomes a mediator. He succeeds because he refuses to be trapped in the static opposition between friend and enemy. He reminds Agamemnon that Ajax was not only an enemy, that he also has a place in the human order. Ending the conflict means instituting the possibility of coexistence again. Ulysses gives priority to the consciousness of a common humanity. This is the hallmark of a thought sufficiently supple to embrace the complexity of reality, to make the other's point of view prevail, far from the archaic assertion of force. This defines the political humanism I claim for my own. If the tale of the Greek heroes who died before Troy continues to move us, this is because it gives us the portrait of men crushed by the force they thought themselves masters of, doomed to destruction for having swept away by excess. Ulysses, for his part, will survive. After 10 years of war before Troy and 10 years of wandering on the high seas of storms, he will return home profoundly transformed and yet faithful to himself. This lesson of Ulysses, which reaches us from the depths of the centuries, let us make it ours today to confront the chaos of the world, to conjure catastrophe, discerning the need for order and justice that calls us to responsibility. Thank you very much.